She was my whole world and life.
Tonight, a local family is coping with loss after a young mother was killed inside her car.
On a typical November day, the Fox family's life was turned upside down forever. Morgan Fox, a young woman known among her neighbors as a caring mother, attentive daughter, and energetic colleague, disappeared under the most mysterious circumstances. Nothing seemed to foreshadow trouble. Her day began as usual, with a cup of hot coffee in the kitchen and a brief morning chat with her daughter. But within a few hours, the quiet suburban neighborhood had turned into a place of horror and anxiety. When Morgan didn't show up for work and didn't answer her phone, her family's anxiety grew with every passing minute. Parents, neighbors, and friends began calling each other, trying to gather any information they could. At first, hope kept everyone going. Maybe she was just running late, maybe she had left her phone at home. But as time passed, fear and horror began to hang over the house, where just a few hours earlier, life had been normal. Neighbors recalled seeing Morgan leave her house that morning, get into her car, and start the engine, as if she were going to work. No one suspected that those would be her last hours. Her everyday life, caring for her family, working, following her usual routes, suddenly became part of a tragedy, and everyone who knew her felt uneasy. The familiar sense of security disappeared in an instant. The town, where people were used to living a measured life, was thrown into emotional chaos. Newspapers, social media, and conversations among neighbors were filled with questions. Where is Morgan, and what happened? Phone calls and messages, which usually brought joy, became a source of fear. Every call from the police, every knock on the door was perceived as a harbinger of terrible news. Morgan was a person of vibrant energy. Her friends and colleagues described her as a woman who combined caring and a sense of humor, who was active and attentive. She loved planning her days, taking care of her daughter, and discussing upcoming events with neighbors and colleagues. She knew how to find joy in the little things, whether it was the morning light, a cup of coffee, or a child's laughter. It was this contrast between her ordinary, warm life and the sudden tragedy that intensified the shock. People couldn't understand how danger could lurk behind the familiar events of everyday life. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding or an accidental disappearance. But with each passing hour, it became clear that Morgan had been the victim of a deliberate crime. Morgan's family and friends were in a state of panic. Every corner of the house, every object seemed suspicious. The phone left on the table, the bag lying on the sofa, the car parked in the driveway. Everything that had been familiar before now became evidence that something had gone wrong. Her parents couldn't find any explanations, and her neighbors were afraid to go outside. The first hours after Morgan's disappearance were filled with anxiety, fear, and hopelessness. People gathered at the house, discussing the events and trying to understand what had happened. Emergency services responded quickly, but even experienced police officers acknowledged that this was an unusual case and that every minute counted. This story shook the entire neighborhood. People who had previously perceived their lives as stable and safe now felt vulnerable. Morgan's disappearance was not just a personal tragedy for her family, but a shared pain for the entire community. Every detail, the smell of coffee, a toy on the floor, a locked car door, became a symbol of how the familiar world can be lost in an instant. During the first hours and days after Morgan's disappearance, the entire city was preoccupied with one thought: where is she? An atmosphere of anxiety, uncertainty, and fear filled the streets, homes, and hearts of the people. With each passing hour, the realization that an ordinary day could turn into a tragedy made the situation even more tense.
Morgan's family is outraged over what they consider a creepy and long post on the suspect's public Facebook page.
A day that began like any other turned out to be Morgan Fox's last. The morning of November 4th, 2020, in the suburbs began with the usual sounds. Birds outside the window, quiet footsteps on the wooden floor, the aroma of fresh coffee. Morgan woke up early, as always, to make breakfast for her daughter and check on things at home before work. Her morning rituals, a cup of coffee, checking her schedule, a quick glance at her messages, seem mundane, but it is these little things that become important when looking back on the tragedy. Morgan was energetic and attentive. She always tried to plan her day so that she could get everything done: work, taking care of her child, meeting with friends. On this day, she planned to arrive at work a little early to finish preparing for a meeting with colleagues and pick up some necessary documents before starting her usual workday. Her friends and colleagues recalled that she looked cheerful, smiling, and focused that morning. No one could have guessed that these familiar actions would be her last. She exchanged messages with friends, discussed the upcoming week, and planned a shopping trip. Even the most ordinary things, choosing clothes, eating breakfast, kissing her daughter goodbye, now seemed filled with tragic meaning. After breakfast, Morgan packed her bag and checked that she had everything she needed: documents, phone, wallet. She left the house, closed the door, got into her car, and drove to work. The road was quiet, autumn leaves rustled under the wheels, and the morning light fell softly on the streets. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. The last hours of Morgan's life were filled with ordinary, everyday concerns, but at the same time, her day left behind a chain of small details that would later help investigators piece together the events. She stopped at a gas station, bought coffee, and checked her phone. Messages and calls were recorded on digital devices, which became an important source of information for the investigation. Morgan planned to meet with friends after work to discuss upcoming business, and then pick up her daughter from school in the evening. These plans seem small and ordinary, but they reflect her everyday life, which was so unexpectedly cut short. Her relatives recalled that she was always punctual, attentive, and predictable in her actions. Throughout the day, she communicated with her colleagues, discussed project details, and confirmed meeting times and routes. At first glance, her day was normal, but as time passed, the police noted that her last movements and calls showed suspicious signs. Cars that did not belong to her neighbors were recorded in the area of her home and on her way to work, and calls from unknown numbers went unanswered. After work, Morgan planned to return home, but on the way, an event occurred that changed everything. The details of the last minutes of her life are recorded by surveillance cameras, witness statements, and analysis of phone calls. She drove through familiar streets, stopped her car at a store, checked her bag, and talked on the phone. Each action seemed to be part of her usual routine, but it was the last witness to her life. Morgan's relatives later talked about her habits. She always paid attention to the people around her, checked that everything was in order at home, took an interest in her neighbors' affairs, smiled, and engaged in conversation. These habits paint a picture of a person who was attentive to the world and to people, but nothing could protect her from the tragic event that occurred shortly thereafter. That evening, Morgan was supposed to return home, spend time with her daughter, prepare dinner, check on household matters, and simply be with her family. However, this reunion did not occur. The last signals from her phone show her on the driveway of her home, then her disappearance. Small details, the locked door, the bag on the back seat, the lack of signs of a struggle, would later become key to the investigation. Neighbors later recalled seeing her car in its usual spot that day and hearing the sound of the engine, but no one could have guessed that these familiar sounds would be the last. The atmosphere of the neighborhood, quiet and peaceful in the morning, was filled with anxiety by evening. People began to realize that something terrible had happened. Morgan Fox's last day was a combination of routine, small joys, and ordinary concerns that turned into tragedy in an instant. It is attention to detail, her habits, and daily activities that will allow investigators to reconstruct the events and understand what happened during those fateful hours.
2 days after Morgan was killed, a vigil was held outside of her home. You can still see the flowers and candles. Megan says she's deeply disturbed because she believes the alleged killer showed up at that vigil and even posted pictures on that same Facebook page.
When Morgan didn't come home that evening, her family's concern quickly turned to panic. Her daughter was left without her mother, her father couldn't get through to her, and Morgan's phone was silent. At first, her relatives tried to find explanations. Maybe she was delayed at work, maybe she stopped by to see friends, maybe she accidentally left her phone at home. But after a few hours, it became clear that something had gone wrong. Neighbors, hearing that Morgan had not shown up, began asking each other if anyone had seen her car or noticed anything unusual. Everything was as usual, and at the same time, nothing was as usual. There was a sense of unease in the air, which grew with each passing hour, turning into a feeling of impending disaster. Fox's parents immediately contacted the police. Patrol officers arrived within a few hours and began interviewing neighbors, checking surveillance cameras and reviewing phone records. Every little detail became potential evidence. What cars had passed by, who had been watching the street, who had seen Morgan in the last few hours. Late in the evening, the police received the first alarming confirmation. Morgan's car was found in the driveway of her home, but there were no signs of movement inside. Her bag was on the back seat, and the door was locked. At first glance, there was no evidence of violence, no signs of a struggle, no signs of a break-in, and no suspicious individuals recorded by neighboring houses and cameras. But it was this fact that heightened the alarm. A person could disappear without a trace. The search began immediately. Neighbors, friends, and relatives joined forces, combing the surrounding area, parks, streets, paths, and empty houses. The police brought in dogs and checked nearby bodies of water, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Every item found in the area of the disappearance was recorded as potential evidence. Over time, the first clues began to emerge. Street cameras recorded unknown cars passing by Morgan's house. Some witnesses recalled seeing strange figures moving near her car between 9:00 p.m. and 11:10 p.m. These observations seemed random, but every little detail was important to the investigation. Morgan's phone became a key element in understanding what had happened. The last ping signal showed that it had remained stationary throughout the night and then switched off completely. This made it possible to reconstruct the approximate location of her disappearance and the time when she became inaccessible to the outside world. Family, friends, and neighbors spent sleepless nights checking every detail. People brought food for the search parties, put up posters with Morgan's photos, and posted on social media asking for help. The entire neighborhood became a single living organism, focused on finding the missing woman. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that some acquaintances and neighbors had seen suspicious activity in the area around her home. These testimonies narrowed down the circle of suspects. The police began a thorough analysis of all of Morgan's contacts in recent days. Colleagues, friends, former acquaintances, possible chance encounters. A key moment came when items were found in the backyards of the neighborhood. A bag of personal belongings left at the edge of a wooded area that could have belonged to Morgan. These findings indicated that her disappearance was not accidental and that someone was deliberately trying to cover their tracks. With each passing hour and day, the search became more intense, involving more resources and specialists. Investigators used modern technology, analysis of phones, cameras, GPS signals, drones, and dogs to trace Morgan's route and try to find her traces. The discovery of her car and the first clues was the moment when alarm turned into a clear understanding. This was a crime, carefully planned and executed. The community was shocked and horrified to realize that in their world, normal life could be destroyed in an instant. From the first hours after Morgan Fox's disappearance, the police knew that the case would be difficult. The missing woman was young, independent, and had an active social life, and any deviation from her usual route immediately caused alarm. Investigators began by examining all of Morgan's contacts, from work to friends and neighbors, analyzing every phone call, message, and email. One of the first steps was to interview everyone who could have seen Morgan in the last hours before her disappearance. Police officers questioned colleagues, friends, and neighbors, and checked surveillance camera footage in the area. Each piece of evidence was carefully recorded and compared with the data already available. It turned out that shortly before her disappearance, Morgan had been on the phone with a person who later turned out to be a key suspect. This information became the first major lead that the investigation was going to pursue relentlessly. The following days of the investigation were intense and busy. The police carefully checked Morgan's and the suspect's phone signals and analyzed their routes. Every movement was recorded, creating a detailed map of the events of the last few hours. At the same time, work was carried out on the ground, drones surveyed hard-to-reach areas, dogs searched for traces, and experts examined Morgan's car, which remained at the scene. During the investigation, the first evidence of the suspect's involvement gradually began to emerge. Cameras recorded his car near Morgan's house that night. Witnesses recalled seeing an unknown man near the car. The police studied recordings from shops, gas stations, and other locations along the suspected route. Every detail fell into place in a single chain of events. The investigation was not limited to technical means. The suspect's friends and relatives were questioned. Criminal psychology experts helped to compile a psychological profile of the potential culprit. What motives could have led to the kidnapping? What actions could have preceded the disappearance? Analysis of the suspect's behavior, habits, and social connections provided clues to understanding his actions. Investigators paid particular attention to the suspect's home and the surrounding area. Small items that could have belonged to Morgan were found there, as well as traces indicating an attempt to hide evidence. Each find was recorded with the utmost care. The experts understood that even the smallest detail could be decisive in the subsequent court proceedings. The investigation also checked the alibis of the suspect and his associates. Initially, he denied any involvement, claiming that he was at home on the night of the disappearance. But analysis of phone signals and witness testimony destroyed this version. Contradictions began to emerge. Someone saw him on the street, cameras recorded the movement of his car, and phone data indicated his presence in the area of Morgan's home. Investigators began reconstructing the night of the disappearance. Using GPS signals, witnesses, and cameras, they created a step-by-step map of the suspect's actions. Each of his steps was compared with Morgan's last movements. It turned out that the man who allegedly happened to be nearby was acting systematically and purposefully. Gradually, the investigation began to narrow down the circle of suspects. Confirmations began to emerge: messages from Morgan's phone, evidence found in the vicinity of the suspect's home, and testimony from people who had seen strange activity on the night of the disappearance. This allowed the police to prepare a well-founded indictment and proceed with the arrest. One of the key steps was the examination of evidence, analysis of fingerprints, DNA, shoe prints, and fabric samples. This data helped link the suspect to the crime scene and create a body of evidence that later formed the basis of the indictment. Every detail was carefully documented so that the person's involvement in the crime could not be disputed in court. Gradually, the investigation moved into the phase of actively investigating a specific individual. Investigators understood that they needed to act quickly so as not to lose the opportunity to find evidence before the suspect could destroy or hide it. Operational activities included searches, interrogations, analysis of digital traces, and the search for possible witnesses. After several weeks, the investigation reached its final stage, the preparation of the indictment. All the collected data was summarized: phone routes, witness statements, physical evidence, and the suspect's behavior. All this created a unified, consistent picture of what happened on that fateful night. The result of this painstaking work was the arrest of the suspect. His arrest was the culmination of the investigation. The police had compelling evidence that allowed them to confidently press charges. The public breathed a sigh of relief, but at the same time, the horror of what had happened remained. For Morgan's family, friends, and neighbors, the investigation was an opportunity to find answers. Every day, every discovery added to the confidence that the truth would be established and the guilty would be punished. But even with the arrest, a terrible fact remained. The events of that night left an indelible mark, and the lives of those who knew Morgan would never be the same again. The suspect in the Morgan Fox disappearance case was George Birch, a man who, before the tragedy, seemed like an ordinary member of the community. He worked at a local business, socialized with his neighbors, and participated in the life of the town. No one could have imagined that behind his outward routine lay dark thoughts and dangerous intentions. The police immediately began to carefully study George's biography. His past turned out to be complicated: repeated conflicts with the law, complaints from former neighbors and colleagues about aggressive behavior. Investigators looked for signs of violence in his life to understand what could have pushed a person to commit such a serious crime. Each episode, each complaint became a piece of the mosaic that allowed them to reconstruct his psychological profile. The investigation focused on the suspect's recent contacts with Morgan. Phone records and witnesses showed that he often watched her, took an interest in her schedule, and sometimes met with her under various pretexts. These actions formed a logical pattern. George was preparing for the moment when he could take complete control of the situation. George's arrest was an important milestone in the investigation, but understanding the motive required much more. Investigators analyzed the relationship between him and Morgan. At first glance, they were ordinary acquaintances, perhaps even life partners, but the details showed that George had an obsessive interest that crossed the boundaries of normal human relationships. He did not like that Morgan led an independent life and was free to make her own decisions. This feeling of intrusion and fear of losing control became the catalyst for the crime. Court documents and witness testimony revealed a chain of threats and conflicts that preceded the tragedy. George repeatedly tried to convince Morgan to change her habits and follow his instructions, sometimes resorting to covert tricks to keep tabs on her. All of this pointed to obsessive control and psychological aggression, preparing for a situation that ultimately ended in murder. During questioning, George initially denied any involvement. He said that he was at home that night and knew nothing about Morgan's disappearance. However, the evidence gathered by the police, camera recordings, GPS signals, witness statements, and physical evidence, completely destroyed his alibi. Psychologists who analyzed his behavior noted that such denials are typical of people trying to protect their reputation and at the same time justify their actions in their own eyes. According to investigators and judges, the motive for the crime was a combination of a greedy desire for control and a fear of losing power over the lives of those around him. George couldn't accept that Morgan was a free person who could make her own decisions. His actions showed that murder was a way to eliminate the threat he felt from her independence. After his arrest, the investigation also focused on details confirming the premeditated nature of his actions. The police examined items found in George's home, his digital devices, and his social media posts to identify patterns. All of this painted a clear picture. Morgan's murder was planned, thought out, and carried out by a man who sought complete submission and control. At the trial, prosecutors described in detail how George's psychological obsession led to tragedy. Every action he took before, during, and after the crime showed his intent and cold-bloodedness. Testimony from friends, colleagues, and experts showed that the motive was not a momentary outburst of rage, but the result of prolonged preparation, emotional dependence, and a desire for power. The court considered all the evidence gathered, including the suspect's psychological profile, behavior, and motives. The verdict showed that the crime was premeditated and deliberate. George Birch was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Morgan's family, friends, and fellow citizens, understanding the motive was a difficult but important step. They realized that the tragedy was not the result of a random coincidence, but the systematic, deliberate actions of a man incapable of accepting the freedom of others. This information became the basis for restoring justice and protecting Morgan's memory. The trial of George Birch ended with his conviction for the murder of Morgan Fox. The verdict confirmed that the crime was premeditated and the result of an obsessive desire for control and psychological obsession. George was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. For the Morgan family, the verdict did not end their suffering. The tragedy left a deep void, but they were able to find at least some moral relief. Justice had prevailed, and the criminal had received his deserved punishment. Friends, neighbors, and the entire town felt that this case was a warning about how dangerous obsession and the desire to control someone else's life can be. The memory of Morgan Fox lives on through stories about her life, friendship, dreams, and kindness. Her story reminds us that tragedy can happen to anyone, but the memory of a person remains immortal, and society is capable of responding to evil with determination and justice.